Este video es de Sadman, nos lo comparte nuestro amigo, más bien lo tradujo Uriel Micto, no, Uriel Redpill, y no recuerdo quién lo compartió. ¿Fuiste tú, Decar, no? Bueno, creo que
Sí.
lo vi allí en Twitter y de ahí lo guardé. Qué bueno. Para todos aquellos que dicen que hay feminismo bueno y que todo ese tipo de cosas, esto es el control que las mujeres quieren establecer sobre sus parejas, es algo desde tiempos inmemoriales, ¿no? Ya ven que hay hasta una pinche tablilla sumeria de una mujer que se queja de que no le dejaron suficiente dinero y que una mujer de una aldea o de una casa ahí de la vecina tiene una mejor casa que la de ellos y que ella no puede tener cosas bonitas porque su marido no gana suficiente dinero. Ya saben, lo mismo que sucedió hace 2000 años sigue pasando ahora. Bueno, a ver, dejen puro esto por acá, porque tengo acá los misiles y aviones. Quiero quitar el chat del Discord, más que no lo encuentro. Ok, ahí está. Para que se puedan ver los subtítulos. Que todos en silencio, por favor. O que solamente, bueno, sí dura bastante tiempo. Yo creo que lo vamos a cortar a la mitad.
Or suffragettes. Hi everyone, Sandman here. Today I'm going to talk about how early feminists, or suffragettes, were responsible for prohibition in the early 20th century, and how it was used as an excuse to destroy the traditionally male space known as a bar or a saloon. The temperance movement helped to stop the sale of alcohol in the United States from 1919 up to 1933 through prohibition, but its roots are found before the US Civil War. At that time, it was a movement that was run predominantly by men, which is why it didn't succeed. Men typically use logic and reason instead of shaming tactics to convince other men and women to take a particular course of action. Anyways, it took a woman's touch for prohibition to become the law of the land. Women had a major role in the temperance movement in the early 20th century, and in fact, there were more women involved in the temperance movement than the suffrage movement at that time. But many of the women in the temperance movement focused their efforts on the suffrage movement instead, because they recognized that if women got the vote in the United States, they would have a better chance of implementing prohibition by influencing politicians. I think it's important to understand why women wanted men to stop drinking alcohol, and how the suffragettes and temperance movement were the first types of organized feminism to succeed in the modern age. Women hate alcohol because drunken men are less productive. Alcohol also reduces men's ability to get an erection, so women had a harder time tempting their husbands, as men preferred getting drunk instead of having sex with their own wives. Not to mention that the money spent on alcohol could have been used to purchase shoes, dresses, and many other consumer goods enjoyed predominantly by women. Saloons and bars were a threat because men spent more money drinking instead of at home with their wives and children. Saloons have traditionally been male spaces for most of history because women have been perpetually pregnant during most of history due to higher rates of child mortality. A child with fetal alcohol syndrome would have brought shame to many women, so alcohol was not something they could consume out in the open. Once child mortality rates fell in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women decided that it was time for a full-out assault on male drinking spaces. The first big assault on bars and saloons came in 1873. According to Gail Collins in her book America's Woman, just before Christmas of 1873, about 80 married women marched up to the saloons in Hillsboro, Ohio, demanding that they close forever. The demonstrations went on for months, attracting national attention. A reporter from Cincinnati interviewed a Hillsboro man who said he and his friends walked into a bar and ordered drinks when all of a sudden the rustle of women's wear attracted their attention. And looking up, they saw what they had thought was a crowd of 1,000 ladies entering. One of the horrified men saw his mother and sister, another his future mother-in-law. Soon women in small towns all over Ohio were kneeling in the snow before the town taverns, singing hymns and sometimes taking an axe to the bartender's wares. seemingly spontaneous assaults on saloons, which were in fact frequently urged by the male temperance lecturers, occurred nearly in 1,000 communities, involving tens of thousands of women over a period of about 6 months. It was the start of an anti-alcohol crusade by America's middle-class women that would continue until Prohibition made that law legal in 1919. Traditionally, husbands would spend all day working and then go out for a few drinks after work. And women were excluded from both the factories or offices as well as the bars and saloons. Men would typically spend all of their weekdays away from the family and help around the house on Saturdays, and sober up just in time to look respectable on Sundays, so the wives could display their husbands at the local church on Sunday. Many people assume that Sundays are God's day in the Christian faith, but they are really an excuse for women to meet together and parade their husbands and children for all to see. Nothing made women salivate more than getting the family dressed in their family best for Sunday. Religion was used as an excuse for women to have a fashion show. It's not God's day of worship, but the day for worship of women and their fashions. Today, on the other hand, it seems that every day is the day of worship for women. It's no wonder no one goes to church anymore. Once women invaded traditionally male work and leisure spaces, they could keep an eye on their men and make themselves the center of attention in each of these places. Many women are like the Gestapo. They gather intelligence and then call a meeting with their girlfriends to decide the fate of some poor male soul. My father was alive during the Second World War, and he told me many stories about how a Gestapo agent saw something suspicious, and then he would never really handle it himself. Instead, he used his hand crank radio to call in for immediate backup. And then a whole bunch of agents would show up and intimidate or beat some poor young guy on the street. This is how women act. They don't take immediate action based on their own emotions. Instead, they discuss their feelings with other women, and they gather together and form a consensus, and then take subtle actions to encourage what they deem to be appropriate male behavior. Women, it seems, can be rational when it comes to manipulating the feelings of men to do their own bidding. But if their subtle maneuvers don't work, then they have no problem becoming violent for their causes. I found another quote from Gail Collins' book called America's Woman to describe how women invade male space in the late 19th and early 20th century, and how they use violence to get men to conform to their own wishes. Here's the quote. "The ultimate symbol of saloon smashing was Carrie Nation, who first drew national attention in 1900 when she walked into a rather elegant bar in the Hotel Carrie in Wichita, Kansas, and threw 2 stones at a huge nude painting of Cleopatra at the bath, ripping the canvas. She shattered a $1,500 mirror, drove the patrons from the room with her cane, and broke all the bottles and glasses on the bar. Her second husband left her when she had become a celebrity, and she embarked on a career of lecturing, smashing, and publishing magazines. She also inspired imitators like Mary Sheriff, who organized the Flying Squadron of Jesus, 15 women who raided bars along the Oklahoma border. Women were violent and destroyed property and weren't punished to the full extent of the law. In fact, they became revered celebrities for trashing traditionally male spaces. Once women became free of the never-ending cycle of birthing and childbearing that they were doing up until the 20th century, they started thinking about their own personal rights. For most of history, women didn't have the time to look after their own rights. The irony of Prohibition is that it backfired in their face. Governments in the United States collected taxes on liquor, and now that tax revenue was gone and was going into the hands of male mobsters. The Prohibition laws were unenforceable, and there were more alcoholics than ever before. Men went to illegal drinking establishments, so women had an even harder time finding their husbands in the evenings. Secret male drinking saloons were popping up all over America in the 1920s. The legal system became inundated and backlogged with drinking-related court cases. The cost of Prohibition was too great for the government. The government said enough is enough once the Great Depression began. The tax revenue from liquor looked good as many other sources of government income disappeared during the Great Depression. This wasn't the first time women tried to outlaw male spaces where beverages were consumed. The first proto-feminists in the 1670s in England tried to outlaw the drinking of coffee. In 1675, King Charles II of England banned coffee. All male coffee clubs were popular among the British aristocracy and intellectual classes. According to the women that pushed the king to ban coffee, they were complaining that coffee was making their husbands Frenchified pansies who lost all interest in having sex with their wives. History has proven that whenever men gain intellectual and sexual freedom, women are there with the shameful gossip to destroy male spaces and convince men that the only stimulant and drug that men need is a woman's vagina. I'm putting a link to the 1674 petition against coffee that women presented to the King of England. I'm gonna do my best to translate the language from that time. Please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong.
Si disfrutas del video hasta ahora, este es el momento perfecto para dar like y dejar un comentario sobre el tema, ya que esto ayuda a que crezca el canal con el algoritmo de YouTube. De antemano, gracias. Continuamos.
De todo lo que todo lo que ha narrado Satman hasta este punto, como forzosamente, si los hombres tenemos algún estímulo intelectual, deportivo, algo que disfrutemos más que la compañía de una mujer o del sexo, algo que nos satisfaga más que la compañía de una mujer o el sexo, a ellas les parece una completa amenaza y tratan de quitarnos el gusto o tratan de prohibirnos el hecho de que nosotros podamos disfrutar de esa actividad.
Latín.
Dime, Ares.
Esto me recuerda a una frase que dijo un fundador de la masonería, que dijo: la masonería es el único lugar donde el hombre es libre. Si las mujeres nos diesen libertad de forma natural, no haría falta la masonería.
Es que es eso, o sea, aquí estaban hablando acerca de las coffee shops, o sea, las tiendas de café o algún club donde se pueda disfrutar de un inofensivo café. Luego son los bares, luego el club de caballeros, ya ven, ¿dónde está el señor Gentleman's Club? Y por ejemplo, la masonería, más allá de toda su repercusión acerca de si es una secta, si es un grupo de poder, si son los Illuminati, los Anunnaki y todas esas cosas de conspiraciones, pues también es un club de caballeros, un club de hombres con sus fines y todo ese tipo de cosas. Anteriormente ya solamente quedaba el internet y luego los videojuegos. Y no importa dónde vayamos, no importa si vamos a Marte o si vamos fuera de la pinche galaxia, muy probablemente luego nos van a prohibir cualquier cosa que disfrutemos, porque las mujeres necesitan por completo la seguridad de que tienen la atención masculina, y también ellas necesitan la seguridad de que los hombres somos completamente dependientes de ellas. Por eso mueren y están temblando de miedo por el hecho de que muy probablemente en el futuro van a tener competencia en la forma de robots o de una simple doll, ¿no? Entonces, ¿por qué? Insisto en esto y no me voy a cansar de decirlo. Las mujeres dependen dependen en mayor o en menor medida, pero tendiendo a totalmente del trabajo masculino, ya sea de forma directa o indirecta. Inclusive simplemente para tener seguridad. ¿Sí? ¿Por qué? Por el simple diformismo sexual de nuestra especie. Y eso yo no lo inventé, eso yo no lo hice, y eso no me convierte para nada en un apologista de la violencia ni nada de eso. Simplemente estoy marcando que el mundo es así porque el mundo es así. Yo cuando llegué ya estaba así. Cuando tú llegaste también y haz algo al respecto, cámbialo. No puedes, no puede nadie. ¿Sí? Continuemos con el video.
The first page of the petition is saying that England was once a paradise for women because of the brisk activity of men, and women were the most able performers or workers of Christendom. But now there is a decay of the true old English vigor. Our gallants or gentlemen have become Frenchified. On this first page, you can see that the women writing the petition are using shaming language directly aimed at the king, basically saying that his subjects are like the French, which is a big insult to the English monarch. Also saying that they were once the most able performers of Christendom, is saying that they are no longer the best Christians in the world. On this second page, I found this line extremely entertaining. We have read how a prince of Spain was forced to make a law that men should not repeat the grand kindness to their women about 9 times in a night. But alas, alas, those forwards days are gone. This is yet another shameful attack on the king, saying that Spanish men were making love to their wives 9 times a night, and that a prince in Spain had to draft a law to stop men from having sex with their wives so much. The women in the petition go on to say that coffee is insufferable and a disaster, and this is another quote. Excessive use of that newfangled, abominable, heathenish liquor called coffee, which rifling nature of her choicest treasures, and drying up of the radical moisture, has so eunuched our husbands, and crippled our more kind gallants, and they are become as impotent as age, and as unfruitful as those deserts whence the unhappy berry is said to be brought. You can surely see that women were scared that men would begin to gossip and lose interest in sexuality altogether. Women thought men were gossiping about them in coffee houses, but what was really happening is that they were being intellectuals. It's almost as if the women of Britain wanted their men to remain dumb brutes and not learn to communicate with each other. This is where I believe a woman's strength of influence lies, not in changing or influencing the minds of men, but creating situations where men are unable to communicate with each other.
Ok, yo creo que esa es la parte más importante y por lo cual nuestra amiga Lacey, nuestra tía de Fizz, nuestros amigos Púas, ya golpeé el micrófono, nuestros amigos Púas, ¿cuál otra chica? Xiomara, las de Attraction Lab, a ver, ¿cuáles otros pinches? Póngame en los comentarios, bueno, aquí en el chat, gente que venda humo aquí en internet y que esté en contra de la filosofía, por decir la verdad.
El supercondón.
Ah, de veras, el máximo exponente de la charlatanería. Sí, el supercondón. Acá nuestro amigo, un tío blanco hetero, el Quetzal. Pero bueno, Quetzal es homosexual, o sea, él tiene mucho que perder por esto. Acá, por acá dicen Just Stop. Ah, Just Stop solamente es una youtuber normal. ¿Sí? ¿Quién más? ¿Quién más se me viene a la mente? No sé, o sea, básicamente es eso. O sea, siempre están tratando de meter ruido y están tratando de que nos comuniquemos efectivamente entre nosotros. Ah, nuestro amigo Dante, la opresora Kawaii, Rey Habana, ya son un chingo, o sea, ¿cómo se llamaba el de la así, JZ, nuestro amigo CC, Mario Luna, Álvaro Reyes?
Perdona, tengo un meme collage con unos cuantos de esos ahí recopilados.
Oye, de veras, deberías de hacer un así un fondo de pantalla, o sea, de toda la
Bueno, voy a buscarlo y lo comparto aquí. No están todos los que son, pero sí todos los que están.
Latin, ¿puedo dar yo mi opinión?
Adelante, Albert.
Es como... Estamos en unas situaciones como ir a la guerra. Nadie quiere ir a la guerra. Todo el mundo va a buscar 1001 pretextos para no ir a la guerra, pero lamentablemente estamos en una posición que solamente la guerra es la única solución. Nosotros siempre tenemos, y prácticamente los invitados están diciendo a cada rato, no, hay problemas que... La raíz de los problemas actuales son muchos de que las mujeres tienen mucho poder de decisión actual. Y tienen la capacidad de voto y con ello destruir cualquier gobierno. Pero
¿Tienen mucho poder de decisión? Espera, tienen mucho poder de decisión, pero tienen muy poca voluntad para actuar, o ninguna.
No, lo peor es de que sí tienen voluntad, porque recuerda que en Estados Unidos quieren que el gobierno les dé cosas gratis y votan porque el gobierno les dé cosas.
Sí, pero eso no es voluntad de actuar, eso solamente es...
La gente sale a la calle a protestar por sus tampones gratis. Eso es algo mucho más de lo que yo haría por algo tan irrelevante como un tampón.
Y por acá Decar nos pone acá unos de los tantos que están completamente... que no quieren hacer absolutamente nada, sino que simplemente le quieren meter ruido al mensaje de la comunicación entre los varones. Yo ahí no estoy tanto de acuerdo con Zósimo. Acá Zósimo está en el valle de la negación. No puede estar ahí para siempre. Lo van a sacar... el Zósimo va a salir de ahí algún día. Y no va a ser por voluntad propia.
No lo sé, hasta entonces yo lo considero un enemigo interno.
Bueno, cada quien libre de expresar sus opiniones. En fin. Bueno, no entremos en polémicas por Zósimo. Continuamos con el video.
And thus unable to grow and evolve as individuals or as a collective. This is why women hate it when men go out with their friends. Because if the topics of conversation becomes women, then men might reveal to each other the deception that their own wives and girlfriends present them. You can't have the slaves leaving the plantation and discussing what goes on the plantation without the overseers hanging around. Women lack the ability to adopt to changes in male behavior, so instead they try to prevent those changes from happening in the first place. If changing things causes too much pain and suffering for them, or the state, then they attempt to infiltrate those particular male spaces and destroy them from the inside out. If that doesn't work, then they change the nature of male space into a space that has to cater to women's interests. If you want to read more about this coffee petition, then just follow the link below. Alcohol and coffee actually lower a man's sex drive in most cases. So women were losing the power of the pussy. We can argue that for some women, this is the only real power that they ever have. The ideal that women strive for is one where the state and women walk hand in hand together, keeping men horny and sex-crazed and always interested in their vaginas.
Mucho más contenido y sobre todo sin censura en plataformas alternativas, todas ellas en la pantalla final del video. Hasta pronto.